Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about why athletes should probably do box squats. And for someone who is never going to compete in powerlifting, who's already built a little bit of a base using a conventional back squat, I would absolutely consider using box squats, again, particularly for people who are going to train with fairly large workloads, for people who need more explosiveness and everything else. And I might make a separate video explaining why a lot of novice lifters, I wouldn't write box squats into a novice program, because it's like because novices can't do box squats correctly. And I do mean that literally. That if you prescribe box squats for a fairly untrained lifter, they will be squatting 6 inches high, right? They'll set up an 18-inch box. And that defeats the purpose, because one of the benefits that we get from the box squat is the ability to go in deep, but to go in deep in a way that doesn't allow for the same rounding of the pelvis. You don't get that posterior pelvic tilt, because one of the things you'll notice is that when you sit down onto the box, what do you notice? Right, the lack of posterior pelvic tilt. You can't sit onto the box and put yourself into that negative position for your lumbar. So let's get over to the point. That's one of the benefits. That because of the virtue of the box squat, it's actually slightly easier on your lower back when done correctly. Now, if you bounce onto a box, right? If you bounce onto a box, obviously it's way harder on your lower back. So again, it comes back over to the point of athletes and people who've learned to control their body to some extent. It's a different animal. But when you're even on a low box like that, it mechanically forces your pelvis into a position to where it can't roll under. So that posterior pelvic tilt, or butt wink as we call it, you can't really do it when you sit onto the box, because the weight of your body and the bar itself will push your pelvis back out of that position. So it can actually train you to get rid of it over time. So that's part of it. The other factor with that is that because of the virtue of the box squat, you have to use a slightly lighter weight. You have to use a lighter weight. And what I mean is that even with my clients right now, like I have a client who came in and from day one, he sent me a video of himself back squatting easily to depth, at least an inch below parallel, 315 for a triple. I put him on box squats for one of his squat workouts every week, and with 225 going to a 12-inch box, he is absolutely shocked at how hard it is. Like doing sets of 5, he's like, wow. So for someone who's fairly new to a box squat, 225 could feel as hard as 315. And generally, you find a lot of coaches who work with it usually say anywhere from 10 to 15% weight reduction. So in other words, a 400-pound squatter is probably going to box squat something in the range of 340 to 360. And that's normal, right? You oftentimes lose 10% or more of your strength. And why do you do that? Well, it has to do with the breaking up of the eccentric concentric chain. Well, what does that do for an athlete? Well, it forces you to have to learn to get explosive. It forces you to have to learn to use your hips out of the bottom of a squat, right? You have to use your hips to get yourself moving. And that's something that most athletes need. They need to be able to use their hips. They need to be able to transfer their hip strength into everything that they do on a playing field, a boxing ring, anything that they do. And so the difference there is that you have to learn to get more explosive on this. And when you look at studies that are out there, studies have looked at this, and you know what they found? That the rate of force development on your box squat is much, much higher than either a low bar style squat or a high bar style squat that are back squats. Like this has actually been studied in studies where they've compared them, and you get a much higher rate of force development. So that's something that you need to train athletes for. That's one of the reasons you see some coaches out there have them do half squats or quarter squats, because there's been some data that suggests that those have a higher rate of force production than going all the way to parallel on a back squat. But you do so at the expense of knee shear. You do so at the expense of extra compression on the spine that's not necessary, because you have to go much heavier. In other words, to do some of those half squats or quarter squats, a 450-pound squatter might have to get over 600 pounds. And I believe we saw an NFL player demonstrating that recently, doing those half squats with 675. That guy's a sub 500-pound squatter. And they're doing it for that reason. Well, you get that same benefit out of a box squat. and you learn to use your hips more, to use your hamstrings more, and everything else out of the bottom of it to get yourself moving. So the potential for increasing force production is tremendous. So anyone who needs to be faster and be more explosive, it's an extremely valuable tool for that. Also, because of the nature of it, it can train you to be able to go wider over time. And so you also come over to, what is it that you see a lot of coaches out there will have athletes do one-legged exercises? Why? Because they want them to be able to shift into that side plane. But if you can learn to squat with a much wider stance, you get that same benefit, don't you? Right? We get that same benefit. Well, box squats allow you to train to learn to go a lot wider. And so therefore it does train you to be able to put that outward force on each foot. And again, that carries over into the playing field particularly well. There's a lot of coaches who work with this method. There's a lot of coaches who do use the box squat. They do use the sumo deadlift. They do use all that stuff for their field athletes very successfully. And I'm talking up to the NFL level. And I mean, perfect examples, everyone from Joe DeFranco to Matt Winning. And these guys are doing independent strength coaching for, again, NFL players, college level football players, things like that, very successfully. So it gives you these other tools to do this with. So in terms of just overall athleticism and getting faster and more explosive, it's a very, very valuable tool. Then we have the fact that it puts the least amount of knee shear of any sort of squat, right? It has the least amount of knee shear. And a lot of it has the ability, again, for you to sit back onto the box, and then when you come back up, the knee doesn't travel forward as much on the way back up. And particularly as you get wider and wider, what you find is that you can keep your torso a little more upright depending upon your bar placement. So over time, we're dealing with a situation to where we get less shear on the lower back, we get less shear on the knee, we get a faster rate of force development. We also have consistent range of motion, because if you squat to the same box every time, there's never any ambiguity regarding your range of motion, and it allows for easier training programming, right? Because we're far more consistent in our training programming. So when you start adding all of these things up, we get less stress on the lower back, less stress on the knees, and a slightly lighter weight. Well, what does that mean from a training volume perspective? Well, we know training volume is one of the primary drivers of hypertrophy and adaptation. So if this allows us to do these things with a slightly lighter weight and less wear and tear on our knees and lower back, that means we can train with higher workloads. Well, higher workloads is going to facilitate a better training response because we can recover from it easier. So when you're dealing with, again, athletes who need to maximize workouts and maximize training stress, and who are on very large volumes of training all the way around, who have the time to do it, right? This allows you to train more. You know, for the recreational gym goer, it might not be that big of a deal, but for someone who needs to maximize training volume, it's extremely valuable. Extremely valuable. Then we come over to the fact of, again, the consistency of the range of motion, the explosive element of it, improving explosiveness. It's also easier to do accommodating resistance, bands, chains, things like that with the box squat. Because again, the nature of it, because we come to a full stop and then can explode up. We have the consistency at the bottom. If you get jerked down by a band, you know, coming down, you set onto the box and then come back up. Band work is extremely hard to do with a normal back squat, right? It tends to lend itself better to box squats. And what do we know about the band work? This, again, a lot of coaches have found over the years, if you want to get people as explosive as possible, you have to do band training, right? It's extremely valuable for training explosiveness, speed, strength, these things. And again, what do most athletes need? They need to be faster. They need explosiveness. That's the reason so many of them do cleans and snatches and weighted jumps and jump squats, and all this stuff is to improve explosiveness. Well, band work does that very, very well, and the box squats are simply easier to consistently do band work with. So when you start looking at all these factors, it really makes sense why you would want to do that. It makes a lot of sense as to why you would want to do that. And so again, this is the reason I recommend athletes in general go this direction. And because simply put, yes, the box squat will build your back squat. But if you are never going to test your back squat, you're never going to compete on the back squat, you're never going to do a powerlifting meet, it just isn't that necessary that you train the normal back squat, right? The box squat will give you everything that you want for an athlete. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.